The night before the world turns cold does not announce itself with thunder. It settles quietly over a landscape already in motion, over dark rivers swollen by meltwater, over herds moving along the open edges of forest and grass, over human camps where firelight trembles against hides, bone tools, and watching faces. The air is not yet the air of disaster. It is the air of a planet recovering. Ice that has ruled the north for tens of thousands of years is drawing back. Valleys that once lay under frozen weight begin to breathe again. Plants creep into raw ground. Animals follow the green. People follow the animals. To anyone living then, the world may not feel safe, but it feels possible. The long cold age is loosening its grip, and across immense distances, from Western Europe to the Levant, from the edges of the great North American ice sheets to the river valleys of Asia, human beings are learning the shapes of a new Earth. Then, with a suddenness that still unsettles scientists, that promise falters. The warming does not simply pause. In many places, it reverses. Cold returns like a memory with teeth. Glaciers stop retreating or begin to grow again. Forests thin, winds sharpen, seasons become less generous. The animals that survived the worst of the Ice Age now face another test, and so do the people who depend on them. This is the disaster later known as the Younger Dryas, a name taken not from kings, ruins, or ancient chronicles, but from a small Arctic flower whose pollen appears in the record like a botanical whisper of cold. It is not a disaster in the familiar human sense of a city burning in one night, or an empire falling in one generation. It is stranger than that. It is a climate shock, a planetary turn, a change so deep that it writes itself into ice, mud, seeds, bones, coastlines, and perhaps into the direction of human history itself. Before we go deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, if this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy. Because the story ahead is not only about a cold snap at the end of the Ice Age, it is about how close the human world may have come to taking a different path, and how the foundations of civilization may have been shaped not by comfort, but by instability. Imagine standing near the edge of a late glacial river as evening comes. The banks are raw and unstable, carved by water released from melting ice far to the north. The ground underfoot is a mixture of thawing soil, gravel, and tough little plants that can survive where forests have not yet returned. In the distance, reindeer or wild horses move in restless lines. Somewhere beyond them are larger presences, mammoths in colder, open country, giant deer in patchy woodlands, bison in herds dense enough to darken a plain. Human hunters know these movements not as scenery, but as survival. Their world is mapped in tracks, winds, river crossings, edible roots, flint sources, sheltered hollows, and the remembered places where animals pass at certain times of year. Nothing is abstract. A change in a rainfall means hunger. A change in migration means walking farther. A change in winter means death for the careless and sometimes for the careful too. Yet this is also a world of intelligence and adaptation. People are not helpless figures waiting beneath a hostile sky. They make tools with astonishing skill. They sew fitted clothing from hides. They carry fire, stories, pigments, ornaments, and memories across landscapes. They understand animal behavior with a closeness modern life can barely imagine. They know when snow is safe to cross and when it hides water beneath. They know which stones break into blades, which bones can become needles, which plants return after thaw. In some regions, they gather seeds and nuts with increasing attention. In others, they follow great herds across cold steppes, along coasts, where the sea is lower than it is today. People may travel through lands now drowned beneath continental shelves. What survives in the record suggests a species already deeply inventive, already capable of living in many worlds at once. The Late Ice Age is often imagined as a single frozen nightmare, but by the time the Younger Dryas approaches, Earth is in transition. The worst of the last glacial maximum has passed. Ice sheets still cover enormous parts of North America and Northern Europe, but their edges are melting. Sea levels are rising, not smoothly, but in pulses. Forests are beginning to return into places once dominated by open tundra and steppe. The atmosphere is changing. The oceans are adjusting to floods of fresh water. Animals are shifting their ranges. Humans are changing too, spreading, experimenting, encountering new environments, perhaps also encountering the limits of old ways. The world is not stable. It is becoming. That is what makes the reversal so haunting. It interrupts a recovery already underway. For generations, perhaps, people have watched the world soften. Winters remain dangerous, but there are signs of release. Plants appear where ice had been. Rivers open roots. New hunting grounds emerge. Then the pattern changes. The cold does not return everywhere in exactly the same way, and scholars still debate the precise causes, timing, and regional effects, but the broad signal is real. Around 12,900 years ago, temperatures in parts of the northern hemisphere drop sharply. In Greenland, the change is recorded with extraordinary clarity in the ice. In Europe, pollen records show forests retreating and cold-tolerant plants expanding. In parts of the Near East, conditions become drier, disrupting communities that had begun to rely more heavily on gathered plants. In North America, the story becomes tangled with melting ice, vanished animals, and controversial clues that still fuel argument. No person living through it would have called it the Younger Dryas. No carved tablet names it. No survivor leaves a written account saying the world changed in a year. Writing has not yet been invented. Cities do not yet rise over plains. Kings, tax collectors, armies, and temples belong to futures not yet born. The witnesses are people whose names are gone, whose languages are silent, whose experiences survive only indirectly through the things they leave behind and the changes preserved around them. A hearth in an abandoned camp, a scatter of flint blades, animal bones cut by human hands, pollen sealed in lake mud, air bubbles trapped in ice. The evidence remains incomplete, but it is enough to show that something immense happened, and that human communities stood inside it. The phrase Earth changed overnight is partly metaphor because climate does not behave like a lamp switched off in every valley at once. But it is also not entirely exaggeration. Some ice core evidence suggests that aspects of the shift were extremely abrupt by geological standards, perhaps unfolding within years or decades rather than over many centuries. For a human life, that is almost overnight. A child born into a warming world might grow old in a colder, harsher one. A hunting route learned from grandparents might fail. A valley rich in game might empty. A plant once gathered reliably might shrink back. A coastline might move year by year as seas rise elsewhere, while inland regions become drier and more unpredictable. Disaster, in such a world, is not always a single terrible morning. Sometimes it is the slow realization that the old knowledge no longer fits the land. And yet, from this cold interruption, something begins to gather, not immediately, not cleanly, not according to any simple formula. No single explanation fully accounts for the transformations that follow. But around the margins of this unstable world, human beings begin to lean harder on certain plants, return more often to certain places, build stronger ties, bury their dead with deeper ritual care, and gather in ways that hint at future societies. The disaster does not create civilization by itself. That would be too simple. But it may help tighten the pressure around human choices. It may force old mobile patterns to bend. It may make memory more valuable, cooperation more necessary, and experiments with food more urgent. So the story begins not with a city, but with a campfire under a changing sky. Around it sit people who cannot know that distant ice sheets, ocean currents, and atmospheric shifts are reshaping their future. They cannot know that thousands of years later, scientists will drill into Greenland ice and read the chemistry of ancient snowfall. They cannot know that their scattered tools and hearths will become clues in one of the great mysteries of the human past. They know only the immediate world. The cold coming down, the animals moving differently, the river speaking louder in the dark. The earth is not finished changing, or the night is deep. The old ice is melting, and somewhere inside that fragile promise of warmth, The cold is preparing to return. Long before the cold returns, the Earth is already unsettled. The great ice sheets do not vanish like snow beneath a morning sun. They retreat as continents of frozen weight, cracking, sagging, draining, and reshaping everything below them. At their southern edges, meltwater gathers in vast lakes held back by ice walls and ridges of debris. Rivers run heavier than before, braided into many channels across gravel plains. Hillsides stripped bare by frost begin to carry low shrubs, then grasses, then scattered trees. The land is not simply warming, it is being remade, piece by piece, season by season, in ways no living person can fully measure. To human eyes, it must have felt as if familiar places were becoming unreliable, while unfamiliar places opened like invitations. The world emerging from the Ice Age is not one landscape, but many. In some regions, open steppe stretches beneath wide skies, cold and dry, rich with grazing animals. In others, birch and pine begin to move northward, their pollen drifting into lakes where it will remain for thousands of years. In sheltered valleys, plants return with surprising speed, taking root in raw soils left behind by ice. Farther south, in the Levant and parts of Southwest Asia, people live among pistachio, almond, oak, wild cereals, gazelle, wild cattle, and seasonal wetlands that pulse with birds and fish. Along the coasts, the shape of the world is different from the one known today. The sea is lower, exposing broad plains where now there is only water. Those lost lowlands may have held camps, paths, shellfish beds, and stories. But much of that evidence lies drowned beyond easy reach. A person walking through this world would not see a neat boundary between Ice Age and after Ice Age. They would see mud, thaw, flood, returning green, and danger. A valley that once held animals through winter might become thick with brush and harder to hunt. A plain that once offered long sight lines might slowly break into patchy woodland. New rivers might cut through old roots. Lakes might rise, spill, and drain. The animals themselves would respond faster than people could predict. Reindeer and horse might shift their range. Bison might follow grass into new corridors. Mammoths, adapted to cold open country, would find some of their best habitat shrinking or fragmenting. The evidence remains incomplete, but what survives suggests that both humans and animals were living through a moving mosaic rather than a single stable world. The great surprise of this time is how much life there is at the edge of change. It is easy to imagine the late glacial world as bleak, but many regions were full of movement. Herds moved in seasonal rhythms, birds returned to wetlands, fish ran through rivers swollen by melt. Wild grains ripened in stands dense enough to attract human attention. Nuts and fruits became reliable in some warmer zones. People gathered, hunted, stored, repaired, carried, and returned. They knew that survival depended not only on strength, but on timing. The right place at the wrong season could be empty. The wrong place during a thaw could be fatal. A frozen river could become a road in 1 month and a trap in the next. Human communities during this period were not waiting for agriculture, as if history were holding its breath. They were already making complex decisions. Some groups remained highly mobile, following animals across broad territories. Others returned again and again to favoured places where water, game, stone, and plant foods came together. In the Eastern Mediterranean world, communities associated with the Natufian culture began to live in more settled ways before full farming appeared. They built semi-subterranean stone structures, used sickle blades to harvest wild cereals, ground plant foods with stone tools, and buried their dead with ritual care. Scholars still debate how settled all these communities were and how much they depended on gathered grains. But they clearly show that human life was becoming more anchored in certain landscapes before the great cold reversal. This anchoring matters because a warming world can be generous and treacherous at the same time. When resources become abundant in a particular zone, People may stay longer. When people stay longer, they build deeper knowledge of local plants, animal migrations, water sources, and seasonal patterns. They also form stronger claims, stronger memories, and perhaps stronger tensions. A mobile band can move away from scarcity, though never without cost. A more settled community gains storage, ritual continuity, and local expertise, but it also becomes more vulnerable when the local pattern breaks. A stand of wild grain is not merely food, it is expectation. A spring is not merely water, it is a point around which life organizes. When climate begins to shift again, the danger falls hardest where hope has already taken root. Far to the north, the ice itself is an enormous engine of instability. It reflects sunlight, shapes winds, presses down the crust, and locks up water that would otherwise fill the seas. As it melts, the planet adjusts. Land once crushed under ice begins to rebound slowly. Coastlines change. Fresh water pours into oceans, where salt, temperature, and current help move heat around the globe. The North Atlantic is especially important because it acts like a vast conveyor of warmth, carrying heat northward and influencing climates far beyond its shores. The people living in late glacial camps do not know ocean circulation, but they live inside its consequences. A shift in distant waters can become a colder wind over a hunting ground, a drier season near a seed-gathering camp, or a change in the animals that pass through a valley. There are lesser-known traces of this restless world in places that seem ordinary at first glance. Lake beds hold layers of pollen that show forests advancing and retreating. Beetle remains preserved in sediments can reveal temperature changes with remarkable sensitivity. Because many beetle species live within narrow climate ranges, ancient dung fungus spores can hint at the presence or decline of large grazing animals. Charcoal fragments can show where fire passed through changing vegetation. None of these clues speaks alone. Together they form a quiet archive, written not in human language but in remains small enough to be missed by anyone not searching carefully. What survives in the record suggests a planet reorganizing itself from the ground up. For humans, this reorganization is both opportunity and warning. The retreating ice opens new lands, but those lands are young and unstable. The returning forests offer wood, shelter, and new animals, but they also change the old hunting world. Rising seas create richer coastlines in some places and erase them in others. Melting glaciers feed rivers and lakes, but their waters can burst free with terrifying force. Even abundance may carry danger, because it encourages people to trust patterns that have not yet settled. The late glacial Earth is like a house being rebuilt while its inhabitants are still inside, learning which walls are firm only by leaning on them. So the stage is not calm before disaster. It is alive, changing, promising, and uncertain. The old Ice Age order is loosening, but nothing has replaced it yet. People adapt with intelligence sharpened by necessity, reading the land closely, carrying old knowledge into new terrain, and testing new habits without knowing which will endure. Around their fires, beneath skies clearer and colder than ours, they live in the brief opening between one ancient world and another. The ice is withdrawing. The rivers are rising. Seeds are ripening in places where people will one day build villages, and beneath all this motion, hidden in oceans and ice, the forces that can interrupt the warming are already gathering. The first sign of reversal is not a wall of ice rolling back over the hills. It is subtler, and for that reason more frightening. The seasons begin to lose their recent softness. Spring arrives later. Snow lingers in shaded ground. Plants that had been gaining space begin to retreat, not everywhere at once, but in enough places for the pattern to matter. In northern Europe, open ground expands again where young woodland had begun to take hold, across parts of the North Atlantic world. Winds grow sharper and colder. In Greenland, snowfall carries a chemical memory of the change, and thousands of years later, when scientists read the layers of ancient ice, the shift looks almost like a line drawn across time. Warmth had been returning. Then it stumbles, and the planet falls backward. This reversal is the Younger Dryas, and its name sounds too delicate for the force it describes. Dryas octopetala is a hardy little Arctic alpine flower, low to the ground, pale-petaled, able to live in cold, open landscapes where trees struggle. Its pollen appears in European sediments during this cold interval, a small biological signature of a larger climatic wound. The flower does not cause the cold, of course. It merely survives it, and because it survives, it becomes a messenger. Long after the people of that age are gone, long after their camps are buried or drowned, the pollen of a small tundra plant helps reveal that the world did not pass smoothly from ice to warmth. It shuddered. Around 12,900 years ago, the warming trend that had followed the last glacial maximum is interrupted. The timing varies by region and by the kind of evidence being studied, and scholars still debate the exact sequence of events. But the broad pattern is difficult to dismiss. Temperatures in Greenland drop dramatically. Dust levels and other chemical markers in the ice shift. In parts of Europe, vegetation changes toward colder, more open conditions. In the Near East, where some communities had begun to depend heavily on wild cereals and local seasonal abundance, conditions appear to become cooler and drier. In some areas, the change may be less severe. In the southern hemisphere, the pattern does not mirror the north in a simple way. This is not a single blanket thrown evenly over the planet. It is a disturbance moving through a complicated climate system. For those living through it, the beginning might not be recognized as a beginning. A harsh winter can be explained, a poor plant season can be endured, a failed migration of animals can be blamed on bad luck, overhunting, a storm, a dry year, or the mysterious will of the landscape. Human beings are skilled at absorbing disruption into existing memory. Only after repeated seasons does a new pattern become undeniable. A place that once yielded roots at a reliable time no longer does. A herd that once crossed a valley by early summer arrives late, thin, or not at all. Wetlands shrink. A stand of wild grain ripens unevenly or fails under drought. Cold returns not as one event, but as a new set of rules. The word sudden must be handled carefully. In geology, sudden can mean centuries. In human life, a century is many generations, enough for stories to become ancestral. Yet the Younger Dryas onset appears abrupt even by stricter standards. Some ice core evidence suggests major changes unfolding over a very short period, perhaps within decades, possibly even faster in certain atmospheric signals. The evidence remains incomplete, and no record can translate perfectly into lived experience. But the implication is stark. A person born into a warming world could reach adulthood in a colder one. Grandparents might remember different animals, different plants, different routes, different winters. The disaster is not that the Ice Age returns in full. It does not. The disaster is that the future people had begun to adjust toward is suddenly withdrawn. Climate is often imagined as background, but for Ice Age and late glacial people it is an active force inside every decision. Temperature shapes vegetation. Vegetation shapes animal movement. Animal movement shapes hunting. Snowpack shapes travel. Drought shapes seeds, tubers, fish, and waterfowl. The Younger Dryas disrupts these chains. In colder regions, forests that had begun expanding are checked or reversed, opening space again for tundra and steppe plants. In some middle latitude regions, the issue is not only cold but dryness, because changing circulation patterns can steal moisture as effectively as winter steals warmth. A colder world is not always snowier. Sometimes it is dustier, windier, and more brittle. One of the stranger details preserved in the climate record is that the atmosphere itself seems to breathe differently. Ice cores do not only preserve temperature clues, they hold trapped bubbles of ancient air and traces of dust, sea salts, volcanic particles, and chemical signals carried by wind. When conditions change, these layers change too. The ice becomes a kind of silent instrument, recording shifts in snowfall, storminess, atmospheric circulation, and greenhouse gases. Lake sediments do something similar at a smaller scale. Pollen, algae, minerals, charcoal, insect remains, and tiny fragments of eroded land accumulate year after year. Each layer is modest. Together they reveal a world where the return of cold is not folklore, but physical fact. Still, the younger Dryas is not simple. Some places experience it strongly. Others show weaker or different signals. Some ecosystems respond quickly, others lag. Human groups do not all respond the same way either. A community relying on migratory herds feels one kind of pressure. A community near wetlands feels another. A group gathering wild cereals in a drying region faces different problems from hunters in northern plains. This unevenness matters because it prevents the story from becoming too neat. No single explanation fully accounts for every local change, every vanished species, every abandoned settlement, every new human experiment. The reversal is a framework, not a magic key. The turning point is also psychological, though no mind from that time can speak directly to us. The older world of glacial cold had demanded mobility, endurance, and deep ecological knowledge. The warming after the ice had offered new possibilities, perhaps encouraging some groups to return more often to the same rich places. Then the younger Dryas tests whether those new habits can survive uncertainty. A site that once made sense because it stood near reliable plant food may become less secure. A valley that was useful because animals passed through it may lose importance. A river may flood differently or freeze differently. Human memory must stretch, compare, and revise. The people who endure are not necessarily those with the strongest attachment to old patterns, but those able to recognize when the land has changed its mind. There is a temptation to imagine panic, but survival rarely looks like constant panic. It looks like work, more walking, more watching, more failures hidden inside ordinary days, a tool repaired because the next journey is longer, a child carried through colder wind, a fire kept alive against damp weather, a camp abandoned earlier than expected, a burial placed in ground that freezes harder than before, a meal stretched thinner because the herd has not arrived. These are the human textures behind a climate event. The younger Dryas is written in oxygen isotopes and pollen diagrams, but it is lived in hunger, patience, calculation, and memory. So the warming world does not end. It hesitates. The ice does not reclaim everything. It reminds the living that it has not truly gone. Across the northern hemisphere, landscapes tighten under cold and dryness, and the creatures of the late Ice Age are forced into new arrangements. Humans, already skilled at adaptation, now face a different kind of challenge, not the endless cold their ancestors knew, and not the steady release they may have begun to trust, but a broken rhythm between the two. The Earth has changed direction, and every path across it must be learned again. At the edge of this colder world, human life continues by reading signs that leave almost no trace behind. A broken twig near a game trail, the smell of damp hides before snow, the direction of birds over a wetland, the hardness of ground at dawn, the silence where animals should be moving. For hunters and gatherers living through the younger Dryas, the crisis is not an abstract drop in temperature. It arrives through details. A herd crosses later than expected. A river that once opened a route becomes dangerous with ice. A patch of edible plants returns weakly after a dry season. The old map still exists in memory, but it no longer fits the living land quite as well as it once did. These communities are often described by what they do not have. They do not have cities, writing, bronze tools, kings, ploughed fields, or permanent walls of the later kind. But that way of describing them misses almost everything that matters. They have knowledge of extraordinary depth. They know how to turn antler, bone, stone, sinew, wood, and hide into a portable technology suited to a hard world. They understand the bodies of animals not only as meat, but as material tendons for binding, bones for points and needles, skins for shelter, fat for fuel, teeth and shells for ornament. They carry fire through bad weather. They maintain social ties across distance. They remember where flint can be found, where water remains in dry months, where herds tend to funnel between hills, and where a storm can kill anyone foolish enough to be exposed. The younger Dryas test this knowledge because it changes the relationships between places. A hunter's route is not just a line across land, it is a sequence of expectations. At one point there should be water, at another, shelter. Beyond a ridge, perhaps grazing animals. In warmer decades before the reversal, some of those expectations may have shifted in promising ways. Forest edges expand, wetlands grow, plant foods become more reliable in certain regions, and people may begin to spend longer periods near resource-rich places. Then cold and dryness return, and the pattern becomes unstable. A route that still exists physically may become useless if the animals no longer pass through it. A camp that still has shelter may become dangerous if food disappears nearby. In Western and Northern Europe, groups living in late glacial landscapes face environments that can change sharply between open steppe, tundra, and patchy woodland. Reindeer remain important in some areas, but their movements depend on vegetation and snow. Wild horse, bison, elk, red deer, and other animals occupy different ecological zones, and as those zones shift, hunters must shift with them. Farther east, across the great open spaces of Eurasia, people continue to live with a world of cold-adapted animals, though that world is shrinking and fragmenting. In North America, Paleo-Indian groups move through immense territories where mammoth, mastodon, bison, camel, horse, and other animals still exist for part of this story. The evidence remains incomplete, especially because many camps were temporary, lightly built, or later erased, but the surviving tools suggest high mobility, careful planning, and skill rather than desperation alone. One lesser-known detail is how much social geography may matter. Survival does not depend only on what one small group knows, it depends on who they know. In uncertain climates, distant kin, exchange partners, marriage ties, and seasonal gatherings can become lifelines. A group that loses access to one hunting ground may need permission, welcome, or at least tolerance elsewhere. Stone tools sometimes reveal movement over surprisingly long distances, either because people travelled widely or because materials passed from hand to hand. Ornaments made from shells far from their source suggest networks of contact and meaning. What survives in the record suggests that Ice Age people were not isolated specks wandering empty wilderness. They lived in social worlds stitched across landscapes. Those social worlds must have carried news, not news in written form, and not in the sense of official reports, but memory passed through meetings, gestures, shared work, and repeated stories. The herd was thin beyond the river. The valley to the west had burned. The lake was lower. The old crossing was gone. A child born in one territory might grow up hearing not only myths of animals and ancestors, but practical warnings about places altered by cold, drought, or flood. Scholars still debate how symbolic systems, ritual life, and ecological knowledge intertwined. But there is little doubt that memory itself was a survival tool. The people who endured the younger Dryas were not merely reacting. They were comparing the present against remembered patterns, revising the inherited map. Food is the centre of this pressure. In a stable season, a mixed economy of hunting, gathering, fishing, trapping, and scavenging can spread risk. In a disrupted one, everything depends on timing and flexibility. Large animals provide enormous rewards, but they are not always available. Smaller game, fish, birds, roots, nuts, seeds, and stored foods can make the difference between survival and collapse. In some regions, grinding stones and plant processing tools show that people were investing labour in foods once treated as secondary. These foods may not always be glamorous in the archaeological imagination, but they matter deeply. A handful of seeds, a basket of tubers, or a store of nuts can hold a community through the days when the hunt fails. The hardship is not evenly distributed. Children, the injured, the elderly, pregnant women, and those without strong social support are always more vulnerable when food becomes uncertain. Archaeology rarely allows us to see individual suffering clearly, but burial evidence sometimes hints at care. People with injuries or disabilities sometimes lived long enough to show that others helped them survive. This is easy to overlook, yet it is one of the most profound facts about ancient humanity. In a harsh world, compassion is not a decoration added after survival. It can be part of survival itself. A group that cares for knowledge keepers, skilled toolmakers, children, and the temporarily weak preserves more than bodies. It preserves memory, craft, and future possibility. There is also conflict, though it should not be exaggerated into constant warfare. When resources shift, groups may compete more intensely for the best places, especially water sources, migration corridors, stone supplies, and seasonal gathering grounds. But cooperation and avoidance may have been just as important as violence. Moving away before tensions break, arranging meetings at predictable times, exchanging goods, sharing ritual spaces, or forming wider alliances could all reduce risk. No single explanation fully accounts for how every community responded. Some may have dispersed, some may have gathered more closely, some may have changed diets, some may have vanished from one region only to appear in another, under a different archaeological signature. The cold also changes the emotional landscape. A person who has watched older relatives describe warmer years may feel the world narrowing. A skilled hunter may find that skill tested by animals behaving differently. A gatherer who knows every patch of useful plants may see familiar places fail. Yet uncertainty can sharpen invention. People refine tools, broaden diets, alter seasonal rounds, and learn new combinations of resources. The crisis does not erase human agency, it reveals it. Human beings at the edge of the Younger Dryas are not passive victims of climate. They are interpreters of change, moving through danger with minds trained by generations of observation. And so the campfire from the opening still burns, but it burns in a world less forgiving than before. Around it, people repair points, scrape hides, divide food, tend children, watch weather, and listen for movement beyond the dark. The disaster that rewrites history is not only written in ice cores and ancient pollen, it is written in decisions made at the scale of footsteps, whether to wait, whether to move, whether to trust a route, whether to follow a herd, whether to return to a place that has failed once already. The Earth has changed direction, and human survival now depends on changing with it, without losing the knowledge that made survival possible in the first place. The giants do not vanish all at once. That is one of the first things the bones make clear. Their disappearance is not like a curtain dropping over the late Ice Age world, not a single morning when mammoths are gone from every horizon, and mastodons no longer leave tracks in wet ground. It is slower, patchier, more unsettling. In one region, a species lingers. In another, it is already rare. Somewhere else, it survives in shrinking pockets, pressed between changing vegetation, human pressure, disease, low birth rates, and bad luck. The end of the great animals is not one clean event, and scholars still debate how much each force mattered. But as the Younger Dryas tightens its cold hand around the northern hemisphere, the world of the giants is already fragile, and fragility is often enough. For tens of thousands of years before this, humans have lived among animals larger and stranger than almost anything left today. Mammoths move across open country with long curved tusks and thick coats. Their bodies adapted to cold grassland and steppe. Mastodons browse in woodlands and wetlands, heavier in build, feeding differently from mammoths, tied to another kind of landscape. Giant ground sloths, some immense and slow-moving, feed across the Americas. Saber-toothed cats, American lions. Dire wolves are giant short-faced bears, woolly rhinoceroses, giant deer, wild horses, camels, and enormous bison fill a world where human beings are not yet the dominant large presence on the land. A person walking through these ecosystems must read not only prey, but danger. A carcass is food, but it may also belong to something stronger. A waterhole is life, but it is also a meeting place for teeth, hooves, horns, and hunger. These animals are often imagined as doomed because humans arrived with weapons. But the truth is more complicated. Humans are formidable hunters, especially in groups, with planning, patience, and tools sharpened by generations of skill. A well-made spear point or dart point, used with knowledge of animal behavior, can bring down creatures far larger than the hunter. But hunting a mammoth is not casual work. It requires coordination, timing, risk, and perhaps many people. It may also rely on landscape traps, river crossings, soft ground, cliffs, snow, or moments when animals are vulnerable. The archaeological record contains kill sites and butchery evidence, yet it does not show humans slaughtering every species everywhere in a simple wave. The evidence remains incomplete, and it suggests a story in which human hunting matters, but not always in the same way or to the same degree. Climate is the other great pressure. Large animals are not merely large bodies, they are living systems tied to particular plants, seasons, and ranges. Mammoths thrive in a cold, dry, productive steppe tundra, sometimes called the mammoth steppe. A vast environment of grasses, herbs, and low shrubs that once stretched across much of northern Eurasia and into parts of North America. As the climate warms after the last glacial maximum, this habitat begins to fragment. Forests expand in some regions, wetlands change, snow cover shifts. Then the younger Dryas brings cold back, but not necessarily the old mammoth world in its full richness. A return of cold does not automatically restore the exact plant communities that existed before. Ecosystems can break and reassemble in new ways. For animals specialized for vanished combinations of climate and vegetation, that is a dangerous problem. One surprising detail is that extinction can happen even when a species seems still numerous to human eyes. Large animals often reproduce slowly. A mammoth herd can appear powerful and enduring, yet if fewer calves survive, if females reproduce less often, if drought reduces food, if hunting takes breeding adults, and if groups become isolated from one another, the decline may become irreversible long before the last animal falls. Extinction is often not a dramatic final battle. It is arithmetic hidden inside ordinary seasons, a few bad years, a few missing young, a few herds cut off from better grazing, a few more animals taken by humans at exactly the wrong time. No single explanation fully accounts for every loss, but small pressures can combine into a catastrophe when a population has little room left to absorb them. In North America, the timing is especially haunting. Near the end of the Pleistocene, many large mammals disappear within a relatively narrow window, overlapping with both human expansion and major climate instability. Mammoths, mastodons, native horses, camels, giant ground sloths, saber-toothed cats, dire wolves, and others fade from the landscape. Some species vanish quickly in the record, others linger longer in scattered places. The Clovis culture, famous for its finely made fluted stone points, appears around this period and has often been placed at the centre of debates about hunting and extinction. But even here, the story resists simplicity. Clovis people were skilled hunters, and they certainly interacted with some megafauna, but whether their hunting alone could have caused such broad extinction remains debated. Climate change, ecological disruption, human predation, and cascading effects may all have played roles. The cascading effects are easy to underestimate. Remove or reduce large herbivores, and the landscape changes. Grazing pressure falls. Shrubs and trees may expand differently. Fire patterns can shift as vegetation accumulates or changes composition. Predators that depend on large prey face hunger. Scavengers lose carcasses. Nutrient cycles change because big animals move enormous amounts of plant matter, dung, and minerals across wide areas. A mammoth is not just an animal in an ecosystem. It is a force that shapes the ecosystem by feeding, trampling, digging, moving seeds, breaking branches, and opening paths. When such animals decline, the world becomes quieter, but also structurally different. The disappearance of giants is not only the loss of bodies, it is the loss of ways the land once worked. For humans, the vanishing of megafauna would have been practical, emotional, and symbolic. Practical, because large animals provide meat, fat, hides, bones, tusks, and raw material on a scale few smaller animals can match. Emotional, because generations of knowledge are built around powerful creatures, where they go, how they behave, how to avoid them, how to hunt them, how to treat their remains. Symbolic, because animals of such size enter imagination, even without written myths. The repeated presence of mammoths, bison, lions, and great deer in Ice Age art suggests that animals were more than calories. They were part of how people understood the living world. What survives in the record suggests a deep relationship between human attention and animal power. Some species survive beyond the main extinction pulses in isolated refuges, and these late survivors make the story feel even more poignant. Woolly mammoths persist on Wrangel Island in the Arctic, long after they vanish from most mainland regions, surviving into a world where human civilizations already exist elsewhere. Their final disappearance comes thousands of years after the Younger Dryas, showing again that extinction is not a single global instant. It is a pattern of retreat, refuge, and final loss. By then, the great open worlds that supported them have mostly disappeared or changed beyond recognition. The last mammoths are not the rulers of a vast Ice Age plain. They are remnants on an island, living echoes of a world already gone. The Younger Dryas does not kill every giant by itself. It is not a simple executioner, but it arrives during a dangerous transition. When habitats are shifting, human hunters are expanding or intensifying their presence in many regions, and large animals are already under pressure. In that sense, the cold reversal may act less like a single cause and more like a closing door. Populations that might have survived a warmer, smoother transition face harsher conditions. Populations that might have survived hunting alone face climate stress. Populations that might have survived climate alone face human pressure. The disaster lies in the combination. As the giants fade, the human world changes too. People who once followed immense herds must rely more heavily on smaller animals, fish, plants, stored foods, and local seasonal resources. Hunting remains important, but the old balance shifts. The disappearance of large prey may push communities toward broader diets and more careful use of plants. It may increase the value of places where food can be gathered predictably. It may help explain why, in some regions, people begin to look at seeds not merely as wild abundance, but as something worth tending, protecting, and eventually planting. The path to civilization is not built on extinction alone, but it passes through a world where the largest animals no longer hold the land as they once did. By the firelight, the change would be felt before it was understood. Fewer tracks in the mud, longer journeys between herds, old hunting places growing silent, children hearing stories of animals they rarely see, tools once made for one kind of pursuit adapted for another. The earth has not only turned cold, it has begun to empty, across plains, woodlands, wetlands, and river valleys. The great bodies that shaped the late Ice Age world are disappearing, leaving behind bones, tusks, cave images, and questions. Human beings survive, but they survive into a smaller world, one where the absence of giants becomes part of the landscape itself. The cold that returns during the Younger Dryas may begin far from the people who feel it most. It may begin in places few humans ever see clearly, at the edges of ice sheets where the world is groaning under the weight of its own thaw. There, Meltwater gathers in impossible quantities. It pools against walls of ice. It fills basins carved by glaciers. It spreads into lakes so vast they resemble inland seas, cold, grey, and unstable, held back by barriers that are not permanent stone but frozen dams, gravel ridges, and the temporary architecture of a melting planet. These are not quiet lakes in the familiar sense. They are stored catastrophe. At the end of the Ice Age, North America is dominated by enormous ice sheets, especially the Laurentide ice sheet, a frozen mass that covers much of present-day Canada and reaches down into the northern United States. To the west, the Cordilleran ice sheet presses over mountains and valleys. Between ice margins, hills, and drainage divides, meltwater collects. One of the most important of these bodies is often called Lake Agassiz, a vast glacial lake that forms along the southern margin of the retreating Laurentide ice sheet. At different times, it covers enormous areas of central North America. Its shorelines, now stranded far from any modern coast, remain like ghostly bathtub rings across the land. Beaches, deltas, and sediments mark where water once stood in a world still recovering from ice. Lake Agassiz is not merely large. It is dangerous because it has no stable future. As the ice retreats and land rebounds, the lake's outlets change. Water that once drained one way may be blocked, then spill another way. An ice dam can hold for years, then fail suddenly. A channel can open toward the Mississippi Basin, the Great Lakes, the St. Lawrence, or perhaps northward and eastward depending on the configuration of ice and land at the time. Scholars still debate the exact routes, timing, and volumes of meltwater pulses connected to the Younger Dryas. But the central idea remains powerful, immense freshwater releases into the North Atlantic could have disrupted ocean circulation and helped trigger or strengthen abrupt cooling. The mechanism is elegant and terrifying. The Atlantic does not move heat only by surface winds or sunlight. It also depends on the sinking of dense, salty water in northern regions. Warm water flows northward, releases heat, becomes colder and saltier, and sinks, helping drive a broader circulation system that moves warmth through the ocean. Add enough fresh water, and the surface ocean becomes less salty, less dense, and less willing to sink. The great conveyor weakens. Heat transport changes. Regions around the North Atlantic cool. The people living in Europe, Greenland, and parts of Western Asia never see the fresh water entering distant seas, but they may live beneath the altered winds and seasons that follow. A flood in one continent can become a climate shock across an ocean. No single explanation fully accounts for every feature of the Younger Dryas, and the freshwater story is not without unresolved problems. Some proposed flood routes do not line up neatly with all dates. Some sediments are difficult to interpret. The climate system may have been sensitive before the largest pulses occurred. There may have been multiple freshwater events rather than one decisive flood. But the image of rivers of broken ice is not a fantasy. The late glacial world truly contains floods on a scale that modern memory struggles to hold. Glacial lakes burst, ice margins collapse. Meltwater cuts channels into raw land with violence that can rearrange valleys in days or weeks. These floods leave marks that still appear across landscapes. In some places, dry spillways wider than modern rivers show where torrents once passed. Giant current ripples, oversized gravel bars, and scoured bedrock reveal flows far beyond ordinary streams. In the Pacific Northwest, the Missoula floods, caused by repeated failures of an ice dam holding glacial Lake Missoula, carve the channeled scablands in a series of catastrophic outbursts. Those floods are not the direct cause of the Younger Dryas, but they show what Ice Age water can do when restrained too long and then released. Water becomes geology in motion. It strips soil, carries boulders, gouges channels, and leaves behind a landscape that looks wounded even after thousands of years. For people living near such systems, the danger would be more immediate than climate theory. A glacial lake outburst flood can arrive with little warning. The first sign might be a sound like wind or thunder where no storm appears. Then water rises with impossible speed. Trees break. Ice blocks grind through channels. Gravel, mud, carcasses, and entire banks move together. A camp too close to a floodplain might vanish without leaving a trace archaeologists can later recognize. People who survive would remember high water, broken ground, drowned animals, and routes erased by force. The evidence remains incomplete because floods are excellent at destroying evidence. Some of the most dramatic human losses may have left almost nothing behind. Fresh water also works more slowly through coastlines and river mouths. As ice melts, sea level rises, and the shorelines known to late glacial people move. Lowlands become marshes, then tidal flats, then seafloor. Rivers extend and then drown back. Fishing places shift. Shellfish beds appear and vanish. Coastal camps, which may have been crucial to human survival and migration, are now often submerged. This creates a strange imbalance in the archaeological record. Inland stone scatters may survive, while rich coastal worlds disappear beneath water. What survives in the record may therefore understate how many people lived along the edges of the sea and how much they depended on resources now hidden offshore. The rivers themselves become unpredictable partners. Meltwater can make them generous, full of fish, birds, and wetland plants. It can also make them unstable, prone to shifting channels and sudden floods. Braided rivers spread across wide gravel beds, dividing and rejoining like living veins. Crossing them is dangerous. Following them may be useful, but only if one understands their moods. In colder phases, ice can jam and release water abruptly. In warmer seasons, melt can swell currents. A river valley that appears to offer shelter and food can become a trap if water rises too quickly. Ancient people would have known rivers intimately, yet even deep knowledge has limits when the ice upstream fails. There is a lesser-known human consequence hidden inside this watery chaos. Migration routes may have opened and closed with startling speed. Ice-free corridors, river valleys, shorelines, and exposed plains could invite movement for a time, then become blocked by water, ice, forest, or rising seas. In North America, debates about early human movement often involve routes along the Pacific coast, interior corridors between ice sheets, and changing access to animals and plants. The Younger Dryas period falls after humans are already present across much of the Americas, but the shifting ice and water still matter. They reshape the environments those people must cross, hunt, and remember. A route is not only a passage through space, it is a fragile agreement between climate, land, and timing. The flood hypothesis also changes how the disaster feels. It suggests that the Earth's systems are connected in ways no ancient observer could see. Meltwater from ice sheets influences ocean circulation. Ocean circulation influences temperature and rainfall. Temperature and rainfall influence plants. Plants influence animals. Animals influence humans. Humans then alter their movements, diets, settlements, and rituals. The chain is vast, but the effects arrive locally. In a failed harvest of wild grain, a missing herd, a colder wind, a flooded crossing, a lakeshore abandoned to mud. The disaster is planetary, yet it is experienced as a series of intimate disruptions. Somewhere near the ice, water breaks free. Somewhere far away, a winter sharpens. Somewhere else, a group of people waits for animals that do not come. No one can connect these events as scientists later will, through cause, sediments, models, and arguments over dates. But the connections exist whether or not anyone can name them. The late glacial Earth is not a collection of separate landscapes. It is one restless machine of ice, water, air, land, plants, animals, and human decisions. As rivers of broken ice pour toward the sea, the world's hidden circulation trembles, and the cold that seemed to belong to the past finds a path back into human history. Long after the rivers calm and the ice withdraws farther north, the disaster remains hidden in places that seem almost silent. It waits in Greenland ice, sealed layer upon layer beneath wind-packed snow. It waits in lake bottoms, where pollen and silt settle so gently that a single season can become a thin line in mud. It waits in caves, peat bogs, ancient shorelines, desert basins, and the chemistry of stones that once formed under dripping water. The people who lived through the Younger Dryas leave no written testimony, but the earth itself keeps records with a patience no human archive can match. To read them, scientists must become detectives of things almost too small to see grains of pollen, trapped bubbles of air, insect wings, ash particles, microscopic algae, spores, isotopes, and fragments of charcoal. The clearest and most dramatic records come from ice cores drilled from Greenland. Each year, snow falls, compresses, and becomes part of a frozen archive. Dust, sea salt, volcanic traces, and tiny bubbles of ancient atmosphere are sealed inside. The layers do not speak in words, but they preserve clues about temperature, snowfall, wind patterns, and atmospheric composition. When researchers measure oxygen isotopes in the ice, they can infer changes in temperature. When they examine dust, they can see whether winds grew stronger or landscapes became drier. When they study trapped gases, they glimpse the air of a world that vanished thousands of years before farming spread across much of the earth. In these cores, the beginning of the Younger Dryas appears as an abrupt shift, a hard turn in the long story of deglaciation. What makes the ice so unsettling is not only that it shows cold, but that it shows speed. The change is sharp enough to suggest that the climate system can reorganize quickly, far more quickly than people once assumed. The evidence remains incomplete in the sense that no single core tells the entire global story, and local effects vary widely, but the Greenland signal is unmistakable. A world that had been warming becomes colder in a geological instant. Scientists can debate mechanisms, feedbacks, and regional timing, but the ice leaves little doubt that the atmosphere over the North Atlantic entered a different state. For human communities, this would not be a graph. It would be weather, hunger, changing animals, and seasons that no longer keep old promises. Lake sediments add another kind of witness. At the bottom of lakes, year after year, material settles in layers, mineral grains washed in by rain or meltwater, pollen blown from surrounding plants, remains of algae and insects, ash from fires, and sometimes traces of human presence nearby. A core taken from such mud can reveal how a landscape changes through time. If tree pollen declines and pollen from cold-tolerant herbs increases, the record suggests a retreat of woodland and a return of more open conditions. If certain aquatic organisms change, the lake itself may have become colder, shallower, saltier, or richer in nutrients. If charcoal rises, fires may have become more frequent. Though fire can result from many causes, each clue is modest, but together they create a portrait of environments under stress. Pollen is especially powerful because plants are sensitive witnesses. A forest does not need to leave written evidence of its disappearance. It leaves absence. In parts of Europe, records show birch and pine giving ground to colder, more open vegetation as the Younger Dryas begins. The small Arctic flower that gives the period its name becomes part of that signal. Farther south, plant records can show dryness as much as cold. In the Levant, shifts in vegetation and water availability matter intensely because human communities there have begun to depend more heavily on wild cereals, nuts, gazelle, and local seasonal resources. Scholars still debate the exact relationship between climate stress and the later rise of farming, but these environmental records show that people in this region were not making choices in a calm world. They were making them in a landscape where rain, plants, and settlement patterns were changing. Other clues come from creatures that rarely appear in popular histories. Beetles, for example, can be extraordinary climate indicators because many species tolerate only narrow temperature ranges. When their remains appear in ancient sediments, they can reveal whether summers or winters were warmer or colder than before. Tiny fossils of aquatic organisms can show changes in lake temperature and chemistry. Spores of fungi that grow on the dung of large herbivores can hint at the presence or decline of grazing animals. When these spores decrease in some records, researchers may infer fewer large animals in the surrounding landscape, though interpretation must be careful. A drop in dung fungus spores might reflect fewer animals, changed animal movement, altered preservation, or shifts in local conditions. No clue stands alone. Bones provide a different testimony, heavier and more direct, yet still difficult. Animal remains can show which species lived in a region, what they ate, how old they were when they died, and sometimes whether humans butchered them. Cut marks, broken bones, and stone tools near carcasses can reveal hunting or scavenging. Isotopes in teeth and bones can suggest diet and migration. Ancient DNA, where it survives, can show population bottlenecks, lost diversity, and relationships between groups. But bones are unevenly preserved. Some landscapes destroy them quickly. Some sites are found only by accident. A species may seem absent from the record long before it truly disappears, simply because its remains have not survived or have not yet been found. The silence of archaeology is never simple. Human traces are even more fragile. A temporary camp may leave only a scatter of stone flakes, a hearth stain, and a few bones. A shoreline settlement may now lie beneath the sea, a floodplain camp may be erased by water. Organic tools of wood, fibre, hide, and plant material usually vanish unless preserved in rare conditions. This means the people of the Younger Dryas are often known through what is hardest and most durable stone, bone, shell, and burned earth. Their baskets, cords, clothing, shelters, songs, gestures, and stories are mostly gone. What survives in the record suggests intelligence and adaptation, but it can never fully restore the texture of a life lived through cold and uncertainty. There are also chemical traces that complicate the mystery. Some studies have identified unusual layers containing materials such as microspherules, nanodiamonds, or elevated concentrations of certain elements in sediments around the Younger Dryas boundary. These claims have fueled debates about whether an extraterrestrial impact or airburst contributed to the climate shift and extinctions. Yet the interpretation of these materials remains contested, and many researchers argue that the evidence is inconsistent, difficult to reproduce, or explainable by other processes such as wildfire, volcanism, normal sedimentary concentration, or human activity. The clues are intriguing, but they do not settle the case. The Earth leaves many signatures, and not all of them point cleanly to one cause. The strength of the evidence lies not in one perfect witness, but in convergence. Ice cores show abrupt atmospheric change. Lake sediments show vegetation shifts. Ocean cores suggest changes in currents and temperature. Glacial landforms reveal unstable meltwater systems. Archaeological sites show human communities altering settlement, diet, and tool use. Bones reveal the decline or disappearance of many large animals. None of these archives is complete, and no single explanation fully accounts for all of them, but together they show that the Younger Dryas is not legend, not speculation, and not a neat story invented after the fact. It is a real disturbance preserved across the planet in many different materials. To follow these clues is to enter a strange kind of time. A grain of pollen becomes a forest, a layer of ice becomes a winter, a chemical ratio becomes a wind, a fragment of bone becomes an animal moving through lost grass, a scatter of flint becomes a group of people deciding where to go next. The disaster that rewrote human history does not survive as a monument, it survives as pattern, as tiny remains aligned across distance, as the same cold message repeated in mud, ice, stone, and bone. The ancient witnesses are silent, but the world around them is not. It has been speaking all along, slowly, patiently, waiting for someone to learn how to listen. The most dramatic explanation begins with fire in the sky. In this version of the story, sometime around the beginning of the Younger Dryas, fragments of a comet or asteroid enter Earth's atmosphere, break apart, and explode over the northern world with force beyond ordinary human imagination. There is no single crater large enough to serve as a simple wound in the ground. Instead, the proposed disaster is scattered airbursts, shock waves, intense heat, wildfires, falling debris, and possible impacts into ice sheets that would later melt away and hide the evidence. It is an idea that feels almost made for legend, because it offers a sudden cause for a sudden cold, a single terrifying moment when the sky itself might have helped change the path of human history. The attraction is obvious. The younger Dryas is abrupt. Many large animals disappear near this broad interval. Human cultures in parts of North America change. Unusual materials have been reported in some sediment layers dated near the younger Dryas boundary. A story that connects these clues through a cosmic impact has a powerful narrative shape. It gives the disaster a visible trigger, a flash, a blast, a rain of burning fragments over ice and forest. It turns climate change from an invisible rearrangement of oceans and atmosphere into something almost cinematic. But science is not satisfied by a story that feels right. It asks whether the traces in the ground truly require such an event, whether they appear consistently, whether their dates align, and whether other explanations fit the evidence better. The proposed impact hypothesis has gathered attention around several kinds of clues. Researchers have pointed to microscopic spherules, tiny rounded particles that can form under high heat, to nanodiamonds, which can be associated with extreme pressure or unusual formation conditions, to peaks in elements such as platinum, to layers rich in charcoal or soot that might suggest widespread burning, and to dark organic rich bands sometimes called black mats, found at various sites in North America and elsewhere. Some supporters argue that these materials together indicate an extraterrestrial encounter at or near the start of the younger Dryas. What survives in the record, they say, may be the residue of an event that was partly erased because it struck ice, water, or unstable surfaces rather than solid rock. Yet each clue carries problems. Microspherules can form through several processes, including volcanism, lightning, industrial contamination in younger contexts, or ordinary high-temperature events. Nanodiamond identification is technically difficult and has been disputed in some studies. Charcoal can indicate fire, but fire has many causes, especially in changing late glacial landscapes, where vegetation, drought, lightning, and human activity all matter. Black mats are not burn layers in a simple sense. Many are wetland or spring deposits that form under particular hydrological conditions, and their presence may say more about changing water tables than cosmic catastrophe. Platinum peaks are intriguing, but they do not automatically prove an impact. The evidence remains incomplete, and some reported signals have not been reproduced consistently at all sites. This is where the debate becomes both fascinating and frustrating. A major impact should usually leave a clear pattern shocked minerals, a crater or crater field, a globally traceable ejecta layer, or other unmistakable signatures. The impact hypothesis for the younger Dryas has struggled because the evidence is scattered, variable, and often ambiguous. Supporters argue that an airburst over ice could leave exactly this kind of elusive record, especially if the physical crater vanished with melting ice sheets. Critics respond that an explanation able to avoid leaving decisive evidence becomes difficult to test. If every missing signature can be explained away by ice, water, or erosion, then the hypothesis risks becoming too flexible. Scholars still debate these points, and the disagreement is not merely about one layer of sediment. It is about what counts as proof when the event being proposed is extraordinary. There is also the question of climate. Even if some kind of extraterrestrial event occurred, it would still need to connect convincingly to the cooling itself. The younger Dryas lasts for roughly 12 centuries, far longer than the immediate effects of an airburst or firestorm. To influence climate at that scale, an impact would likely need to trigger another mechanism, such as destabilizing ice sheets, releasing meltwater, altering ocean circulation, or injecting enough material into the atmosphere to produce longer cooling. But the freshwater and ocean circulation explanations already provide a strong framework for abrupt North Atlantic cooling without requiring a cosmic trigger. No single explanation fully accounts for every regional pattern, but the climate system at the end of the Ice Age was already unstable enough to produce major changes through internal feedbacks. The extinction question is equally complex. A skyburst could kill animals over a broad area if it were large enough, and it could cause fires, destroy habitats, or disrupt human and animal populations. But the megafaunal extinctions do not all line up neatly with one sudden day of destruction. Some species decline before the Younger Dryas, some linger after it, some vanish in different regions at different times. Island survivors complicate the picture further. Human hunting, habitat change, reproductive stress, drought, and ecosystem reorganization all remain part of the story. A cosmic event may sound like the missing key, but the bones do not point cleanly to one lock. The human side of the hypothesis has also attracted popular exaggeration. In some versions outside mainstream research, the Younger Dryas impact becomes tied to lost advanced civilizations, ancient warnings, or hidden global memories of a comet strike. These claims are far more speculative and often unsupported. There is no solid evidence for a vanished technological civilization destroyed at the Younger Dryas boundary. There is no need to invent one to make the period extraordinary. The real story is already large enough: mobile hunter-gatherers, changing climates, disappearing animals, submerged coasts, early plant management, and ritual landscapes emerging before cities. Adding unsupported fantasies often obscures the deeper mystery rather than illuminating it. Still, the impact debate should not be dismissed as merely sensational. It has forced researchers to look closely at boundary layers, fire records, geochemical anomalies, and the timing of late glacial events. It has reminded everyone that Earth's history includes rare catastrophes, some of them abrupt and violent. It has also exposed how difficult it is to separate signal from noise in sediments more than 12,000 years old. The ground does not preserve events politely. It mixes, erodes, floods, burns, freezes, and buries. A layer may be disturbed by roots, animals, water, or later human activity. A sample may be dated from material slightly older or younger than the event it appears to represent. The past is not a sealed box. It is a damaged archive. Perhaps the most honest position is one of careful tension. A cosmic impact remains disputed, with some intriguing claims and many unresolved objections. It is not the established explanation for the Younger Dryas. The stronger mainstream view still emphasizes meltwater, ocean circulation, atmospheric shifts, and the unstable aftermath of deglaciation. Yet the impact debate survives because the Younger Dryas itself feels abrupt, because certain anomalies remain under discussion, and because human imagination is naturally drawn to moments when the sky might have touched the earth with violence. The danger is not in considering such possibilities. The danger is in mistaking possibility for proof. So the disaster remains without a single dramatic culprit. It may not have been one blow, but a convergence: melting ice, freshening seas, shifting currents, changing winds, stressed ecosystems, human pressure, and perhaps other triggers still not fully understood. The Earth did not need a comet to become dangerous. It was already a planet in transition, with ice sheets collapsing, oceans reorganizing, animals under strain, and people adapting at the edge of survival. If fire did fall from the sky, it entered a world already primed for upheaval. If it did not, the mystery remains just as profound. The cold came back, the giants faded, human societies changed, and in the thin dark layers of ancient Earth, scientists still search for the difference between a spark, a symptom, and a cause. When hunger enters a landscape, it rarely appears as emptiness at first. It begins with smaller portions, longer walks, thinner animals, and quiet calculations around the fire. It begins when a place that once rewarded return becomes less certain, when the gathered seeds do not fill the baskets as before, when the gazelle herds pass beyond reach, when fish runs weaken, when winter stores disappear too quickly. During the Younger Dryas, hunger is not the same everywhere, and it does not strike every community with equal force. But in regions where cold and dryness tighten around human life, food becomes less predictable, And unpredictability is one of the oldest engines of movement. People move because they must, but also because movement is knowledge. For hunter-gatherers, the land is not a fixed home surrounded by wilderness. It is a living network of remembered possibilities. A group may know where to find stone in one direction, shellfish in another, shelter in a third, and grazing animals across a distant ridge after the thaw. The problem during a climate shock is that the network begins to fray. One useful place remains good, another fails. A third becomes crowded because others have discovered the same scarcity. Routes stretch longer, timing becomes more uncertain. The journey itself consumes strength. A child who could once walk part of the way must be carried. An elder whose memory is priceless may slow the group, and the group must decide how to preserve both life and knowledge. Migration in this world is not a grand march on a map. It is usually a series of smaller decisions, repeated over seasons and generations. A camp is left earlier, a return is delayed, a valley is avoided, a group follows a river farther than before. Families split for part of the year and gather again when food improves. Some people may move toward wetlands, where fish, birds, reeds, and water plants offer varied resources. Others may move toward uplands where animals still pass. In the Levant, communities that had become more settled in the warmer period before the Younger Dryas seem to face new pressures as conditions grow cooler and drier. Scholars still debate how direct the connection is, but the broad pattern suggests that stress on wild resources may have encouraged people to change how they use plants, animals, and places. The Natufian world is especially important here. Before full agriculture, some Natufian communities in the eastern Mediterranean live in ways that are unusually settled for hunter-gatherers. They build stone-based houses, use grinding stones, harvest wild cereals, hunt gazelle, and bury their dead in formal cemeteries. Their lives show that the line between foraging and farming is not a sharp boundary. People can gather wild plants intensively without planting fields. They can stay in one place for part of the year without becoming villagers in the later sense. They can develop ritual landscapes and deep attachment to place before domesticated wheat or barley exists. What survives in the record suggests experimentation, not a sudden invention. Then the climate shifts. Wild cereals may become less reliable in some areas. Rainfall patterns may change. Gazelle movement may become harder to predict. Some Natufian sites shrink or are abandoned, while others continue or change character. The evidence remains incomplete, and it would be too simple to say that the Younger Dryas directly caused farming. Human choices are never that mechanical. But stress can make old habits less secure and new experiments more attractive. If wild stands of grain are no longer dependable, people who already know how to harvest as you grind, and perhaps encourage those plants, may begin paying closer attention to where seeds fall, where they sprout, and how human action can shape next year's food. Hunger also changes memory. In stable times, memory preserves roots, seasons, and rituals. In unstable times, memory becomes sharper, heavier, and more selective. People remember the year the herd failed. They remember the spring that dried early. They remember the old camp where children were buried, the river crossing that became dangerous, the hillside where grains once grew thick. Without writing, these memories travel in bodies and voices, in repeated movement, in teaching, in ceremony. In the placement of the dead, a landscape marked by loss can become more meaningful, not less. People do not simply abandon places because they become difficult. Sometimes they return because difficulty makes memory sacred. This is one reason burial practices matter. Across late Ice Age and early post-Ice Age communities, burials can reveal care, identity, ornament, and attachment to specific locations. Some graves contain beads, shells, animal parts, pigments, or carefully arranged bodies. Such details do not translate easily into modern categories. They may reflect grief, status, kinship, ritual obligation, or beliefs about animals and ancestors. No single explanation fully accounts for them, but they show that human groups were not only solving practical problems, They were building worlds of meaning while facing environmental uncertainty. When the land becomes unreliable, ceremony may help make it intelligible. It may bind people together when food, movement, and memory are under strain. Movement can also carry stories far beyond their original places. A flood remembered in one valley may become part of a broader tradition. A cold season may become a warning. An animal that vanishes may become larger in memory than it was in life. It is impossible to trace direct lines from younger Dryas experiences to later myths with confidence, and many popular claims go far beyond the evidence. But it is reasonable to think that deep environmental shocks leave marks in oral memory. Even if those marks change beyond recognition over centuries, human beings remember danger through story because story helps organize fear. The details may alter, but the emotional pattern can endure: water rising, cold returning, animals leaving, the old world no longer answering. There is a lesser-known kind of movement too, the movement of materials and habits. Stone from distant sources appears at some sites, suggesting travel or exchange. Shell ornaments move inland. Tool styles spread, shift, and vanish. Techniques of grinding, storing, building, and burying may pass between groups or emerge independently under similar pressures. In a climate-stressed world, contact can accelerate change. A group that learns a new way to process seeds, trap animals, preserve food, or build a more durable shelter gains an advantage. Innovations do not need to appear as dramatic breakthroughs. They can spread quietly through imitation, marriage ties, seasonal gatherings, and the practical authority of whatever works. The hunger of the younger Dryas is therefore not only a story of suffering, it is also a story of reorganization. Communities move, gather, split, return, experiment, and remember. Some old patterns fade. Others harden into tradition. Some people may become more mobile again after earlier settlement. Others may cling more strongly to resource-rich places and defend them more carefully. Some broaden their diets. Some intensify plant use. Some follow animals farther. Some build stronger ritual centers where scattered groups can meet. The human response is varied because the human world is already varied. By now, the disaster has moved from climate into culture. The cold is still in the air, but its deeper force is visible in human choices. A failed food source changes a route. A changed route alters contact. New contact spreads ideas. A remembered loss becomes ritual. A ritual gathering strengthens cooperation. Cooperation allows larger projects. Larger projects prepare the ground for future settlements. Nothing is inevitable, and the path remains uneven. But the direction of history begins to bend under pressure. Around the fires of the younger Dryas, people do what humans have always done when the world becomes uncertain. They move, they remember, they adapt, and in doing so, they carry the broken pieces of one world toward the making of another. In a hard season, a seed stops being a small thing. It becomes a promise that can be carried, hidden, guarded, ground into flour, scattered by accident, or watched with unusual attention when it sprouts again near a camp. For most of human history, plants are gathered from the wild with knowledge as refined as any later farming skill. People know which grasses ripen first, which seeds shatter too quickly, which roots can be eaten only after careful preparation, which nuts store well, which fruits draw animals, and which patches return after fire, flood, or trampling. Long before fields exist, human beings are already shaping plant worlds simply by returning, cutting, burning, digging, carrying, and discarding. The younger Dryas does not create this knowledge. It puts pressure on it. In the Fertile Crescent, that long arc of varied landscapes stretching through parts of the Levant, northern Mesopotamia, and surrounding regions, wild cereals grow in dense stands under the right conditions. Wild einkorn, wild emmer, barley, lentils, peas, pistachios, almonds, and other useful plants form part of a rich seasonal world. Before domestication, people can harvest these resources without planting them. They can cut stalks with sickle blades set into handles, gather grain heads in baskets, dry them, grind them on heavy stones, and cook them into foods that leave only faint traces behind. The stone tools survive better than the meals: gloss on sickle blades, grinding stones worn by repeated use, storage pits, hearths, and charred plant remains all suggest a growing intimacy with seeds. This intimacy is not farming yet. That distinction matters. Farming means more than eating plants. It means a long-term relationship in which humans influence plant reproduction strongly enough that the plants themselves change. Wild cereals naturally scatter their seeds when ripe. Domesticated cereals tend to hold onto them longer, making harvest easier. That shift does not happen in one clever moment. It requires repeated selection, whether intentional or accidental, over generations. People harvest the plants that are easiest to gather, carry seeds back, lose some near camp, protect patches, disturb soil, and return. Over time, certain traits become more common. The evidence remains incomplete, but domestication appears as a slow conversation between human behavior and plant biology, not as a single invention made in one hungry winter. The younger Dryas enters this conversation as stress. In parts of the Levant, cooler and drier conditions may reduce the reliability of wild cereals and other resources. A community that once gathered enough from nearby stands may now have to travel farther, work harder, or accept smaller returns. That does not automatically force people to farm. Many hunter-gatherers respond to scarcity by moving, broadening diet, increasing exchange, or using stored foods more carefully. But where people are already partly settled, already invested in grinding stones, storage, and repeated use of local plant patches, climate pressure can make old habits unstable and new habits more attractive. A wild grain stand that fails is a problem. A wild grain stand that can be encouraged, protected, or replanted becomes a possibility. There is something almost invisible about this turning point. Later agriculture will leave obvious marks: fields, villages, irrigation, animal pens, granaries, sickles, pottery, walls, and eventually written accounts of harvests and taxes. But the earliest shift may look like ordinary gathering intensified by anxiety. A woman cutting wild barley may choose fuller heads without naming selection. A group may clear brush around useful plants because it makes harvesting easier. Seeds spilled near a camp may sprout in disturbed soil enriched by ash and refuse. People may notice that plants grow thickest where they have camped before. Children may learn not only where grain grows, but how human action changes where it grows. No one needs to stand apart from nature and decide to invent agriculture. They are already inside a relationship that can deepen without announcing itself. One lesser-known clue lies in the weeds. Early cultivation often encourages plants that thrive in disturbed ground. When archaeobotanists find not only cereal remains but also the seeds of weeds associated with human disturbance, they can infer that people may have been creating the kinds of environments where cultivated or semi-cultivated plants flourish. This is not always straightforward. Seeds move for many reasons, and interpreting them requires caution. But weeds can be witnesses to human behavior, tiny companions of the first fields before fields are fully fields. They suggest digging, clearing, trampling, burning, tasils, and repeated occupation. In that sense, the first agriculture may not begin with neat rows, but with messy edges around camps where useful plants and human disturbance meet. The human body also changes in this story, though slowly and unevenly. Grinding grain takes labour. Carrying water takes labour. Staying longer in one place can bring new risks. Waste accumulates. Pests gather. Diseases may spread more easily, and diets can become narrower if people rely heavily on a few staples. Early farming is not an immediate improvement in every way. In many regions, later agricultural populations show signs of harder work, dental problems, nutritional stress, and new social pressures. That is one of the great ironies of human history. Farming eventually supports larger populations, villages, cities, specialists, armies, temples, and written civilizations. But for individuals it may bring more toil and less dietary variety. The path to civilization is not simply a climb toward comfort. It is a bargain, and the terms are not always gentle. Yet in the younger Dryas world, the bargain may begin to make sense. Reliable abundance is fading in some places. Mobility has costs. Competition for rich zones may increase. Stored grain can outlast a failed hunt. A patch of tended plants near a settlement can reduce the risk of long journeys. A community that invests in seeds also invests in place, and place changes social life. People who expect a return must think differently about storage, ownership, inheritance, burial, and obligation. A granary is not only a container for food, it is a container for future time. It says that the group expects to be here again, or expects someone connected to them to be here. It turns a landscape into a claim. This does not happen everywhere. Many communities continue hunting, gathering, fishing, and moving in highly successful ways for thousands of years. Farming is not destiny, and it is not a sign that one way of life is superior to another. It emerges in particular landscapes under particular pressures, with particular histories of plant use and settlement. Scholars still debate why domestication appears when and where it does, and no single explanation fully accounts for it. Climate pressure matters, but so do population, local ecology, social networks, ritual life, technological skill, and chance. The younger Dryas may be one force among many, a narrowing of options that makes certain experiments more valuable. By the time the cold begins to loosen, some human communities have changed their relationship with seeds in ways that cannot easily be undone. They have learned that food is not only found, but coaxed. They have learned that the future can be stored in pits, baskets, and dry rooms. They have learned that returning to the same place can create both security and obligation. The disaster has not handed them civilization. It has given them a harder question: how to survive when the wild abundance they know becomes unreliable. Their answer begins quietly, with hands cutting grain, stones grinding kernels, eyes watching where seeds fall, and memory measuring one season against another. In a cold and uncertain world, the smallest things become heavy with history. Before cities rise, before walls gather families into streets, before kings claim grain and scribes begin counting the world, people are already building places that seem too large for ordinary necessity. On a hill in southeastern Anatolia, limestone pillars stand in rings and enclosures, carved with animals whose bodies still carry the nervous power of wildlife foxes, snakes, boars, birds, scorpions, aurochs, and creatures that seem to move between memory and symbol. This place is now known as Göbekli Tepe, and it unsettles old assumptions because it suggests that monumental ritual architecture appears before full farming villages dominate the region. The builders are not city people. They are not servants of a written state. They are communities still deeply tied to hunting, gathering, wild plants, seasonal movement, and the fragile abundance of a world emerging from the Ice Age. The timing matters. Göbekli Tepe belongs to the broad aftermath of the younger Dryas and the early Holocene, the period when the cold finally begins to release its grip and warmer conditions return. But its roots lie in the same transforming world already traced through ice, hunger, seeds, and movement. People in this region have lived through instability. They have watched landscapes shift from late glacial cold into warming, then back toward younger Dryas dryness and uncertainty, then toward renewed warmth. They have seen wild animal ranges change, plant communities reorganize, and human settlement patterns deepen around certain places. Scholars still debate exactly how climate stress, ritual gathering, and early cultivation relate to one another. But the broad picture is difficult to ignore before cities. People are already coming together in ways that demand cooperation far beyond the needs of a single small camp. Göbekli Tepe is not a simple temple in the later sense, and it should not be imagined as a lost city hiding beneath the soil. There is no evidence there for palaces, streets, markets, or the ordinary domestic clutter of a large urban settlement in its earliest monumental phases. Instead, the site appears to be a special place, repeatedly built, used, modified, and eventually buried. Its great T-shaped pillars, some weighing many tons, are arranged with care. Two taller central pillars often dominate the enclosures, shaped in a way that may suggest stylized human forms, with arms and hands carved along their sides in some cases. Around them, animals crowd the stone. The effect is not decorative in the modern sense. It feels like a world being summoned into order through carving, labour, and gathering. The lesser-known wonder is not only that people carved the pillars, it is that they organised the work, quarrying limestone, shaping pillars, moving them, setting them upright, preparing floors, maintaining enclosures, and feeding the people involved all require coordination. Even if the population gathered seasonally rather than living there permanently, the project implies social agreements strong enough to bring groups together again and again. That may be the true revolution hidden in the stone. Not a mysterious technology, not impossible engineering, not a vanished race, but the ability of mobile or semi-mobile communities to cooperate around shared meaning at a scale once thought to belong only to farmers and chiefs. The evidence remains incomplete, but what survives in the record suggests that belief and social gathering may have helped build the road toward more complex society. This reverses an older story. For a long time, it was tempting to imagine that farming came first, then surplus, then settled villages, then temples. Food production would create extra resources would support specialists, and specialists would build ritual monuments. Göbekli Tepe complicates that neat sequence. It suggests that ritual may not merely be a luxury produced by agriculture. Ritual may be one of the forces that encourages people to gather, cooperate, stay, return, store food, manage resources, and eventually cultivate more intensively. In other words, people may not have built sacred places only because they had become settled. They may have become more settled partly because sacred places drew them back. The animals on the pillars deepen the mystery. They are mostly wild animals, not the domesticated sheep, goats, cattle, and pigs that will later define village economies. Foxes leap in stone, snakes twist, boars bristle, birds stand alert. Dangerous creatures appear with striking frequency. This is not the art of people who have left the wild behind. It is the art of people still thinking through the wild, still living with animal power as a central fact of existence. Some carvings may represent threats, ancestors, clans, spirits, seasonal stories, or ritual beings, but no single explanation fully accounts for them. Without writing, their precise meaning remains out of reach. Yet the choice of animals tells us that the builder's imagination is rooted in the same living world that climate change has been rearranging. Nearby regions add another layer. Across the northern Fertile Crescent, early communities begin experimenting with more permanent architecture, storage, plant use, and social gathering. Sites such as Nevala Chori, Jerf El Ahmar, and others show that Göbekli Tepe is not an isolated miracle, though it is extraordinary in scale and preservation. The broader region is full of experimentation. People build communal structures. They bury the dead in meaningful ways. They use stone, plaster, bone, and carved imagery to make places more than shelters. The shift from mobile foraging to village life is not one invention, but a long, uneven transformation. Göbekli Tepe stands like a bright flare inside that transformation, revealing how much was already happening before the familiar markers of civilization appear. Climate instability may have made such gathering more important. When food sources become unpredictable, wider networks help reduce risk. Ritual gatherings can allow groups to exchange information, marriage partners, materials, stories, and obligations. They can turn scattered communities into a larger social world. They can also create pressure, because feeding gatherings requires planning. If many people meet at a special site, they need food. Wild game may be hunted in greater numbers. Wild grains may be collected more intensively. Storage may become more valuable. Certain plant patches may be protected or encouraged. The ceremony itself may increase the need for dependable resources, nudging people toward deeper management of plants and animals. There is a quiet irony here. The first steps toward civilization may not have been driven only by hunger, but by meaning. People do not live by calories alone. Even when calories are scarce, they gather to bury the dead, to mark seasons, to renew alliances, to face fear, to remember animals, to bind communities through shared labor, and perhaps to make sense of a world that has changed too quickly. A stone circle is not just architecture, it is a social machine. It brings people together, focuses attention, stores memory in place, and asks future generations to return. By the time warmer Holocene landscapes spread more firmly across the region, the old world of pure mobility has already begun to shift. People are still not urban, not civilized in the later narrow sense, but they are creating durable centers of meaning. The disaster that began with cold has led, indirectly and unevenly, to new forms of cooperation. The same species that once followed herds across open country now raises pillars on a hill and covers them with animals carved from stone. The giants outside are fading. The wild remains powerful. Seeds are becoming more important. Gatherings are becoming larger. Memory is being fixed into the ground. Before the first city, before the first king, before the first written word, human beings are already building places where the invisible weight of a changing world can be held upright in stone. While cold reshapes the inland world, the sea is quietly preparing another kind of disappearance. It does not strike like a flood from a broken ice dam, though there are moments when water rises suddenly in certain places. More often, it advances with a patience that makes it easy to underestimate. Year after year, decade after decade, the shoreline moves. A beach becomes a marsh becomes a tidal flat becomes shallow water. Paths once walked by people, animals, and children sink beneath waves. Hearths vanish under silt. Shell middens crumble into surf. Low hills become islands for a time, then disappear. The earth is warming again in the long aftermath of glaciation, and all the water once locked in ice is returning to the oceans. During the last glacial maximum, sea levels are far lower than they are today, in some periods more than 100 meters below modern levels. This exposes vast coastal plains around the world. The map of human life is therefore not the map familiar now. Britain is joined to continental Europe by a broad lowland often called Doggerland. Southeast Asia contains the enormous exposed shelf of Sunderland, connecting islands and mainland into a very different geography. Australia and New Guinea are joined within the larger Sahul landmass. Coastlines stretch far beyond their modern positions. Rivers run across plains that are now seabed, bays, lagoons, estuaries, and fishing grounds exist in places where ships later pass overhead without seeing any sign of them. For late Ice Age and early Holocene people, these coastal lowlands may have been some of the richest environments on Earth. Coasts offer variety: fish, shellfish, birds, seals in some regions, edible seaweeds, freshwater streams, reeds, marsh plants, driftwood, and seasonal animal movement can all converge near shorelines. A coastal group can combine land and seafoods in ways that reduce risk. When inland hunting fails, shellfish may remain. When storms make fishing impossible, plants, birds, or small game may help. It is likely that many human communities use these drowned landscapes heavily, but the evidence remains incomplete because the sea has taken the best archives and hidden them under sediment, tides, and depth. This creates one of the great blind spots in human history. Archaeology has often been forced to study what remains on dry land, not necessarily where people most often lived. A stone tool scatter on a hill survives. A camp near an ancient river mouth may not. A cave above the sea can preserve bones and art. A seasonal fishing camp on a low coastal plain may now lie beneath mud, sand, and shifting currents. What survives in the record may therefore exaggerate inland life and understate coastal life. The people who watched the sea rise were not marginal figures at the edge of history. They may have been central to migration, survival, and innovation, but their world is among the hardest to recover. Doggerland shows this loss with particular force. Between Britain and mainland Europe once stretched a landscape of rivers, wetlands, forests, grasslands, and lakes. It was not merely a land bridge for animals and humans passing through. For a long time, it was a homeland. People hunted there, gathered there, likely fished and camped along its rivers. Bones, tools, and ancient environmental remains brought up by fishing nets and seabed surveys hint at a vanished world beneath the North Sea. As sea levels rose, Doggerland shrank. Higher ground became islands. Storms and waves reworked the land. Later, a massive submarine landslide off Norway, known as the Storegga Slide, triggered a tsunami that may have devastated remaining low-lying areas, though scholars still debate exactly how many people were living there and how severe the local human impact was. By the time later farmers and monument builders appear in Britain, the old road to Europe is gone beneath water. The sea also changes memory. People do not need modern instruments to notice that land is being lost. A family can remember where a shoreline used to be. Grandparents can point toward water and speak of ground that once held trees. A burial place may become threatened by tides. A freshwater spring may turn brackish. A path to a hunting ground may become a crossing by boat, then an impossible distance. Rising seas turn geography into grief. They make absence visible every day, because the horizon itself creeps inward. It is impossible to prove direct lines from these experiences to later flood traditions, and many popular claims go far beyond the evidence. But it is difficult to imagine that such changes left no mark on human stories. In some places, rising water may encourage movement inland. In others, it may intensify coastal life for a time. As new estuaries and wetlands become productive, the sea is destructive, but also generous. It drowns camps while creating fisheries. It cuts off old routes while opening travel by boat. It erases lowlands while forming islands that can become distinct worlds of their own. Human communities adapt by shifting camps, changing seasonal rounds, developing watercraft, learning tides, and exploiting marine foods more skillfully. No single explanation fully accounts for these responses, because coastlines differ enormously. A rocky shore, a river delta, a coral reef, a tidal marsh, and an Arctic coast each demand different knowledge. The drowning of lowlands also reshapes migration. Routes that once followed exposed shelves become underwater corridors of memory. People moving along coasts may have travelled quickly and flexibly, using boats or shoreline resources, leaving traces now submerged. This matters for debates about early human movement into the Americas and across island Southeast Asia, though the timing and details remain complex. Coastal routes can be archaeologically elusive precisely because later sea level rise hides them. The absence of evidence on modern shores does not mean people were absent from ancient ones. It may mean the ancient shore is simply somewhere else, far offshore, under meters of water and sediment. There is a surprising intimacy in submerged archaeology when it succeeds. Divers and researchers sometimes find worked wood, stone tools, animal bones, footprints, or ancient land surfaces preserved beneath water. In rare cases, underwater environments protect organic materials that would decay quickly on land. A drowned forest can still hold rooted tree stumps. Peat can preserve pollen and plant remains. Submerged landscapes can reveal old river channels, lake shores, and marshes. These discoveries remind us that the seabed is not empty. It is a buried human frontier, one of the largest lost landscapes on Earth. As the younger Dryas gives way to renewed warming, the sea becomes one of the main agents of transformation. The cold reversal has tested food, movement, and memory. Now rising water removes entire worlds from view. The future of farming villages, monuments, and cities will unfold on a planet with coastlines closer to our own. But beneath the waves lie older maps, older camps, older stories. The disaster that rewrote human history is not only the cold that returned, It is also the warming that followed, the ice that melted, and the sea that slowly took back the lowlands where people once lived by firelight, watching familiar ground disappear one tide at a time. The cold does not leave in silence. It loosens first in signs too small to become celebration. A thaw comes earlier than expected. Snow withdraws from slopes where it had lingered for generations. Streams run clear for longer in the year. New plants appear in old ground, not as a sudden green miracle, but as scattered arrivals, grasses, shrubs, young trees finding soil where frost once held them back. The air softens. Rain patterns shift again. Animals test new ranges. People who have lived through a harsher world begin to notice that the land is changing its mind once more. The Younger Dryas is ending, and the planet is stepping into the Holocene, the warm interval in which nearly all recorded human history will unfold. Around 11,700 years ago, the sharp cold of the Younger Dryas gives way to renewed warming. In Greenland ice, the transition appears with startling clarity. Another abrupt turn in the frozen record. The chemical signals shift, dust patterns change, and the climate system enters a warmer state. To later science, this becomes one of the markers separating the Pleistocene from the Holocene. To the people alive, then, it is not a boundary with a name. It is a change in weather, water, plants, and animals. It is the return of possibilities, though not the return of the old world. The earth that emerges after the cold is not the same earth that entered it. This is important because recovery is not reversal. When warmth returns, it does not simply restore the landscapes that existed before the Younger Dryas. Some habitats expand, others vanish, and many reassemble in new combinations. Forests spread across parts of Europe and Western Asia. Open cold grasslands retreat, wetlands shift. Rivers settle into different courses. Lakes rise or shrink depending on region. The mammoth steppe, already wounded by warming and fragmentation, fades further. Animals adapted to woodland thrive in some places, while cold, open country specialists lose ground. The evidence remains incomplete in many regions, but the broad pattern is clear. The end of the cold brings abundance to some species and final pressure to others. For humans, this new warmth is not simply easier, it is different. A warmer forest can be rich with nuts, fruits, deer, boar, birds, and wood. But it can also make long-distance visibility harder and herd hunting less predictable. Dense woodland hides animals that once moved across open plains. It changes travel, tracking, shelter, and hunting tactics. People must learn new paths through trees, new seasonal cycles, new foods, new dangers. The old Ice Age skills do not become useless. But they must be adjusted. A spear point made for one kind of animal encounter may not serve every new condition. A seasonal round built around open country herds may need to bend toward fishing, trapping, gathering, and more localized resources. In the Near East, the warming after the Younger Dryas helps create conditions in which early cultivation can deepen. Wild cereals and other plants respond to changing rainfall and temperature. Human communities that have already experimented with gathering, grinding, storage, and repeated settlement now find themselves in a world where staying in certain places can become more rewarding. This does not mean farming appears overnight when the cold ends. Scholars still debate the timing, causes, and regional differences in domestication. But the warmer early Holocene gives many communities a more stable environmental platform on which earlier experiments can expand. Seeds watched through hardship can now become the center of a new way of life. The change can be seen in the growth of more permanent settlements. Houses become more substantial in some regions. Storage becomes more important. People invest labor in places they expect to return to or never fully leave. Stone foundations, plastered floors, storage pits, grinding stones, and communal structures begin to speak of lives tied more closely to particular landscapes. The old mobile world does not vanish everywhere, and many hunter-gatherer societies continue to flourish. But in certain regions the balance shifts. People are no longer only following food across the land. Increasingly, they are arranging life around places where food can be gathered, stored, encouraged, and eventually grown. With settlement comes a different relationship to time. A mobile camp thinks in routes, seasons, return cycles, and memory carried in people. A village begins to think in walls, stored grain, ancestors buried nearby, repaired floors, and the next planting. The future becomes local. It is no longer only out there, beyond the ridge where animals may move. It is under the ground where seeds wait. It is inside storage bins. It is in the walls that must be maintained. The neighbours who must be trusted, the dead whose presence anchors the living. This new relationship to place carries comfort, but also tension. Food stores can be stolen, land can be claimed, labour can be demanded. Social differences can deepen when some households control more stored wealth, better plots, or stronger alliances. The end of the Younger Dryas also changes the scale of human gatherings. Ritual places, exchange networks, and seasonal meetings continue to matter, but now they increasingly connect communities that are becoming more rooted. People share stone, shells, obsidian, ideas, ornaments, animals, seeds, and perhaps marriage partners across growing distances. Obsidian from volcanic sources can travel far from its origin, showing that early Holocene communities are not isolated villages sealed within their valleys. They are part of wider webs of contact. What survives in the record suggests a world becoming more connected, even as people settle more deeply into particular places. There is a quiet contradiction here. Settlement can make people more local and more connected at the same time. A village fixes life to a place, but stored food, ritual obligations, trade materials, and marriage ties draw that place into wider systems. Once people build durable homes and invest in fields, herds, or managed landscapes, they also create reasons to defend, exchange, negotiate, and remember. The social world thickens. A dispute over a hunting route is one kind of problem. A dispute over stored grain, planted land, water access, or inherited houses is another. The foundations of civilization are not only technological, they are social and emotional, built from trust, rivalry, cooperation, obligation, and fear. The warming world also accelerates the loss of older landscapes. Ice continues melting. Seas continue rising. Coastlines move inland. Some groups benefit from new wetlands and estuaries, while others lose lowland territories entirely. The Holocene is warmer and often more stable than the preceding glacial world, but it is not still. The people living through its beginning inherit both opportunity and erasure. They can settle, plant, gather, build, and expand. But behind them the sea is covering old camps and old paths. The past is being buried at the very moment the future is opening. By the time the cold has fully broken, human history has entered a new corridor. The giants are fewer, forests are wider, seas are higher, seeds matter more. Villages begin to hold memory in walls and floors, ritual places rise from stone and earth. The disaster has passed, but its effects remain inside the choices people now make. The Younger Dryas did not create the Holocene world by itself, yet it helped shape the pressures and experiments that carried humans toward it. After the cold, the earth becomes warmer, greener, and in many places more generous. But it is also a world where survival has taught people to store, gather, build, and return. The long night of reversal ends, and in the thawing light that follows, humanity begins to live as if the future can be planted. Once people begin to live as if the future can be planted, history changes its weight. A camp can be left behind with little more than ash and stone flakes. But a village asks to be maintained. Walls crack and must be repaired. Floors need sweeping, resurfacing, and sometimes burial beneath new floors. Storage pits must be protected from damp, insects, rodents, and hungry neighbours. Seeds must be kept back even when stomachs are empty. Animals, once hunted entirely as wild presences beyond the edge of camp, begin in some regions to move into a closer and stranger relationship with humans. The world after the Younger Dryas is not suddenly civilized, but it is increasingly organized around return, storage, obligation, and the slow accumulation of decisions that bind people to place. The first steps toward farming and village life do not look like the later civilizations of Egypt, Mesopotamia, the Indus, or China. There are no written laws yet, no bronze armies, no palace archives, no tax lists, no monumental city walls in the later sense. What appears first is more modest and, in some ways, more profound. People build houses close together, they store grain, they manage wild and then domesticated plants. They begin to live with animals whose breeding, movement, and feeding are increasingly shaped by human choices. They bury ancestors near or beneath homes. They exchange valued materials over distance. They create places where memory is not only carried in the body, but fixed in architecture, graves, and repeated labour. Climate instability helps explain why this matters, though it does not explain everything. The long shock of warming, reversal, hunger, movement, and renewed warming teaches a hard lesson. Abundance can fail. A rich landscape can change. A dependable herd can vanish. A shoreline can drown. A plant season can turn poor. In that world, storage is not merely convenience. It is a defense against uncertainty. Cultivation is not merely a new food strategy. It is an attempt to negotiate with the future. A village is not merely a cluster of shelters. It is a wager that the benefits of staying will outweigh the dangers of being trapped. The wager succeeds unevenly. Early farming communities face risks hunter-gatherers know how to avoid. A settled group cannot simply walk away from months of invested labour without losing its stored food, planted crops, built houses, and buried dead. Fields can fail. Disease can spread more easily where people waste and animals concentrate. Diets can narrow around cereals and pulses. Work can become repetitive and punishing, grinding grain for hours, hauling water, cutting plants, tending animals, repairing walls, clearing fields, carrying fuel. The path from survival to civilization is not a straight road toward comfort. In many bodies, it may have felt like more labour, not less. Yet farming supports something mobility rarely can on the same scale population growth. Stored grain can feed more children through lean months. Sedentary life can shorten birth intervals. More people can live in one place, though often with greater stress. More people create more labour, more innovation, more conflict, and more need for rules. A small group can settle disputes through kinship, movement, or personal negotiation. A larger village must manage boundaries, storage, work, marriage ties, ritual duties, and access to water or land. As communities grow, social life becomes denser. The same closeness that allows cooperation also creates friction. Out of this friction, hierarchy begins to take shape, not necessarily kings at first, and not always permanent inequality, but differences appear. Some households may have better storage, stronger kin networks, more productive fields, more animals, or greater ritual authority. Some individuals may become skilled mediators, healers, builders, hunters, seed keepers, traders, or ritual specialists. Prestige can gather around generosity as much as control. A person who organizes a feast, distributes stored food, or leads a communal project gains influence. Over time, influence can harden into status. Status can become inheritance. Inheritance can become power. The evidence remains incomplete, and scholars still debate how early inequalities developed in different regions. But the broad tendency is visible once food, land, labour, and memory accumulate in place. People begin to accumulate power around them. Trade expands this transformation. A village may produce food, but it still needs stone, shells, pigments, timber, salt, obsidian, or marriage partners from elsewhere. Obsidian is especially revealing because it can be traced to specific volcanic sources. allowing archaeologists to see how far materials moved. Long before formal markets or merchant classes, goods are travelling through exchange networks that connect distant communities. These exchanges are not only economic, they carry stories. Styles, rituals, technologies, and obligations. A blade made from distant stone is not just a tool, it is evidence of relationship. It says that one place knows another. With more settled life, animals also enter history differently. The domestication of goats, sheep, cattle, pigs, and later other species is not simply the capture of useful creatures. It is a long reshaping of both animal and human worlds. Animals provide meat, milk, hides, dung fuel, traction in later periods, and wealth that can walk. But they also bring disease, labour, and new dependencies. Herds need pasture and protection. They can be stolen. They can fail in drought. They can turn social difference into visible property. A mobile hunter may measure wealth in knowledge, tools, relationships, and health. A herder or farmer can begin to measure wealth in animals, stored grain, and land. That shift changes imagination itself. Ritual grows with these changes, not as decoration, but as structure. Communities facing new tensions need shared meaning strong enough to hold them together. Feasts, burials, ancestor practices, seasonal ceremonies, and communal buildings help transform many households into one social body. They also help justify claims this land belongs to those whose dead are here. This storehouse serves this group. This gathering renews this alliance. This leader speaks for these ancestors or these rites. No single explanation fully accounts for the rise of organized society, but ritual, food, labor, and authority repeatedly appear intertwined. People build not only because they need shelter, but because building together makes society visible. From these village worlds, the later outlines of civilization become possible. Farming creates surpluses in some years. Surpluses support specialists who do not spend all their time finding food. Specialists refine tools, ornaments, buildings, boats, textiles, rituals, and eventually systems of counting. Counting becomes crucial where grain, animals, labour, and exchange must be tracked. Long before writing becomes literature, it is tied to administration measures, tokens, tallies, seals, and memory aids for goods and obligations. Civilization begins not with poetry, but with the problem of who owes what, who stores what, and how much remains before hunger returns. This is the deep legacy of the disaster. The Younger Dryas does not cause civilization like a spark lighting dry grass. Human societies are too varied, too intelligent, and too locally rooted for such a simple story. But the climate shock helps frame the world in which the first major experiments with cultivation, settlement, storage, and large-scale cooperation become increasingly important. It teaches, through hardship, that survival can depend on anticipating scarcity before it arrives. It pushes some communities toward plants, places, and partnerships with new urgency. It leaves humans in a warmer Holocene world carrying memories, habits, and pressures formed in cold uncertainty. By the time true cities finally rise thousands of years later, the disaster is no longer remembered in any clear form. The first scribes do not write its name. The first kings do not know they are ruling in a world partly shaped by ancient ice. Yet beneath their granaries, walls, fields, and temples lies a much older story, people watching seasons fail, people saving seeds, people gathering in ritual, people holding food against fear, people learning that the future can be prepared for. But never fully controlled, civilization is born not because the earth becomes gentle, but because humans learn to build fragile order on a planet that has already shown them how quickly order can break. The disaster still lies beneath the modern world, not as a buried city or a single blackened ruin, but as a lesson written into the systems that continue to govern life. Ice still holds memory, oceans still move heat, forests still answer to rain and temperature, coastlines still shift, though people now build ports, towers, roads, hotels, and cities as if shorelines have signed permanent contracts. The younger Dryas belongs to a world before writing, before kings, before fields fully transformed human life. Yet it remains disturbingly modern. In one respect, it shows that climate can change quickly enough to reshape human choices within lived memory. The people who endured it did not cause it, and they could not measure it, but they felt its consequences in food, movement, loss, and adaptation. For scientists, the younger Dryas has become more than an ancient cold interval. It is a warning about thresholds. A climate system may appear to change gradually, then reorganize abruptly when key conditions shift. Freshwater entering the North Atlantic, changing salinity, weakening circulation, altering winds and rainfall. These processes are not mythic forces from a dead planet. They are part of Earth's operating machinery. Scholars still debate the exact trigger of the younger Dryas. The timing of meltwater pulses, the role of ice sheets, the strength of ocean feedbacks, and the meaning of disputed boundary layer clues. But the larger lesson is clear. Stability can be real and temporary at the same time. Modern climate science studies the younger Dryas partly because it offers a rare window into abrupt change. Ice cores, ocean sediments, lake records, cave deposits, and fossil evidence allow researchers to see how different parts of the Earth system responded. Greenland cooled sharply. Vegetation shifted across wide regions. Hydrological patterns changed. Human communities adapted unevenly. Large animals declined or vanished in many places. The evidence remains incomplete, and no ancient event can be used as a perfect mirror for the present, but the pattern matters. A disturbance in one part of the planet can travel through oceans, winds, ecosystems, and societies. The chain may be complex, but complexity does not make it harmless. There is also a humbling archaeological lesson. Much of the most important human evidence from this time may be missing. Rising seas drowned lowlands where people likely lived, hunted, gathered, fished, and travelled. Floods erased camps. Organic tools decayed. Temporary shelters vanished. Entire traditions may survive only as stone flakes and faint soil stains. The past we reconstruct is therefore not the whole past, but the surviving edge of it. This should make certainty difficult and imagination careful. What survives in the record suggests courage, flexibility, ritual depth, and practical brilliance. But it also reminds us how much human experience can disappear without monuments. The younger Dryas also challenges the easy idea that civilization emerges only from progress. The road toward farming, village life, storage, ritual centers, hierarchy, trade, and eventually cities passes through stress as well as opportunity. People do not begin managing plants simply because they are clever, though they are. They do not gather at monumental sites simply because they have leisure, though some gatherings may require abundance. They do not settle only because the world becomes gentle. They settle us in part because uncertainty makes certain forms of planning more valuable. A granary is a technological object, but it is also an answer to fear. A village is a home, but also a strategy. A ritual center is sacred architecture, but also a way to bind scattered people into cooperation. This does not mean catastrophe is good. Ancient suffering should not be romanticized as the price of later greatness. Hunger is hunger. Loss is loss. A drowned homeland is not redeemed by the fact that other people later build cities somewhere else. The disappearance of mammoths and other giants is not a decorative backdrop to human success. It is a real impoverishment of the living world. But history often moves through unintended consequences. Human beings survive disasters by adapting. And those adaptations can become the foundations of new worlds. The cost remains embedded in the foundation, even when later generations forget it. Perhaps that is why the younger Dryas continues to attract fascination. It sits at a threshold between deep prehistory and the first recognizable steps toward the world of villages and fields. It touches climate science, archaeology, extinction studies, migration, submerged landscapes, and the origins of agriculture. It invites dramatic theories because it is dramatic in truth. but its real power does not require exaggeration. The mystery is not only whether a comet struck, whether a flood changed an ocean current, or whether one cause can be placed above all others. The deeper mystery is how human beings, without writing, without states, without metal, without maps in the modern sense, managed to endure a planet that kept changing the terms of survival. The answer is not simple resilience, a word often used too easily. It is knowledge, cooperation, memory, mobility, experiment, grief, and stubbornness. It is the ability to leave a place and the ability to return. It is the patience to watch seeds. It is the skill to read animal movement. It is the discipline to store food. It is the imagination to carve animals into stone and gather around meanings larger than hunger. It is the capacity to suffer loss without surrendering the future. The disaster rewrote human history because humans answered it not with one invention, but with many small transformations that accumulated until the world itself looked different. Beneath modern roads and fields, beneath cities lit through the night, beneath the confident maps of nations and coastlines, that older lesson remains. The earth has changed overnight before, at least by the measure of a human lifetime. It has turned warm promises into cold uncertainty. It has drowned lowlands, shifted forests, emptied plains of giants, and forced people to remake survival from what remained. The younger Dryas is ancient, but it is not distant. It is part of the ground under civilization, a reminder that human history is not built outside nature, but inside it, always dependent on the moving balance of ice, water, air, animals, plants, and memory. Word count 1061. The last image is not of catastrophe, but of quiet endurance. The cold has passed. The great ice has withdrawn farther north. The rivers still carry meltwater, but their violence is fading into channels, marshes, and silt. On a slope somewhere in the early Holocene, grasses move in a softer wind. Young trees take root in ground once hardened by frost. In the distance, animals cross a clearing. Fewer giants now, more creatures of the warmer forest. Each one following paths written by hunger and season. Near a small settlement, smoke rises from a hearth, thin and blue against the morning. People are awake before the sun is fully high. Someone tends stored grain. Someone checks a woven container for damp. Someone shapes stone with careful blows. Someone watches children near the edge of the houses, where the wild begins almost immediately. The world is still dangerous. It will always be dangerous. But it is also becoming familiar again. Not the same as before, never the same, but familiar enough for memory to settle. Far behind them, the cold reversal is already becoming something no one can name directly. It lives in habits, in caution, in the value of storage, in the pull of gathering places, in the choice to return to the same ground. It lives in stories that may change beyond recognition. It lives in the absence of animals that once shook the earth. It lives beneath the sea, where drowned lowlands keep their silence under green and grey water. And time moves forward. Villages will grow, fields will spread, temples will rise, cities will gather dust and glory, kings will claim descent from gods, scribes will press marks into clay, armies will cross plains where mammoths once walked. Much will be gained, and much will be lost. Yet under all of it remains that older human truth civilization begins not because the world is safe, but because people learn to build meaning and order in a world that is not. So the story ends with the land breathing after cold, with firelight fading into dawn, with seeds waiting in the ground, with human footprints near a river whose course will one day change again. The disaster has passed into the earth, but the earth remembers, and for a little while, beneath a warming sky, the living continue.